This year, in case you haven't looked at your calendar recently, is the 1300th anniversary. No, I don't mean to say that. I mean to say the 1700th anniversary of the recognition of Christianity as a legal religion throughout the Roman Empire. Beginning with the Emperor Nero in 64 AD and continuing until AD 313, Christianity was an illegal religion. A mere profession of faith, or a refusal to offer sacrifice to the emperor as a god, could and sometimes did bring about the death penalty for Christian believers. In the year 313, Constantine, who was a new convert to Christianity, together with his co-emperor Licinius, issued the Edict of Milan, which, for the first time in nearly 250 years, ended Roman persecution and granted liberty of worship to Christians. Well, tonight's lecture is an attempt to commemorate this event, which marked a major beginning, a new chapter in European history. And the School of History, Philosophy, and Religion is sponsoring a series of lectures that are intended to explore the role that Constantine played in the events leading up to the issuance of the Edict of Milan. We've invited 3 distinguished lecturers, all of whom have written on Constantine, to explore various areas of the subject. The first lecture was delivered several weeks ago by Professor Charles O'Dall, who's with us tonight, Professor Emeritus of History at Boise State University. The third of the lectures will be given on November 20th by Professor H.A. Drake, who is Emeritus Professor of History at the University of California at Santa Barbara. Tonight's lecture is entitled Constantine the Pious. It will be given by Professor Peter Leithart. Professor Leithart received his Ph.D. from Cambridge University in theology. He is Senior Fellow in Theology and Literature at New St. Andrews College in Moscow, Idaho, and most recently, just in the last few months, Fellow of Trinity Institute in Birmingham, Alabama. So he skips across the country periodically to offer courses in one or the other institution. He has authored several highly acclaimed books, including special interest to us, Defending Constantine, The Twilight of an Empire, and The Dawn of Christendom. We had hoped to have copies available for sale, but unfortunately Grassroots didn't get the shipment in time. So they will probably get a box full of those sometime in the next few days. And if you're interested, drop by and pick up a copy of this book, which has been highly acclaimed by reviewers. Professor Leithart's lecture, like the others in the series, is supported by generous grants from the Hunter Endowment, the College of Liberal Arts, and the Office of Student Affairs. And I will make one more announcement. Professor O'Dall's lecture, which was given about 3 weeks ago, has been uploaded just today, I think, on YouTube. So if you missed it or would like to hear it again, you're welcome to find it there. Please join me in welcoming Professor Leithart to Oregon State.
Thank you very much. Thank you to the School of History, Philosophy, and Religion here at Oregon State University. And thank you especially to Professor Ferngren for the invitation to come and deliver this lecture. It's an honor for me to be part of this very distinguished lecture series. I feel like the odd man out as something of a non-specialist in Roman history and in late antiquity. And it's a great honor to be included in this kind of series. And I'm also grateful for you all to show up this evening. I know that there's always things that you could be doing. And besides that, there is the 6th game of the World Series that you could be watching instead of listening to me this evening. So I know that it's a great sacrifice, at least for some of you, to be here this evening, rather than by extension in Boston, Fenway Park, watching that game. My topic tonight is not about Constantine per se, about his life and about the historical circumstances of Constantine's life, but rather about the way that Constantine was envisioned and understood throughout the history of Western Christendom and in the Byzantine world in Eastern Christendom. So I want to look at the conception of Constantine and imperial piety. Thank you. Imperial piety and what it meant for an emperor to be pious as that developed through a number of centuries. And I'm going to do that by particularly looking at initially at one presentation of Constantine, which comes out of the church historian Eusebius. He provided one of our major sources for Constantine's life when he wrote the Life of Constantine late in his life, shortly after Constantine had died. He produced the final version of that. And I want to look at how Eusebius presents Constantine, and then compare that with a couple of other accounts of Constantine's life that we find elsewhere in other sources that would have been more familiar to people in earlier generations. In the year 394, this is nearly 60 years after Constantine's death, the Eastern Emperor Theodosius defeated a rival at a battle known as the Battle of the Frigidus River. Because of the similarity between that setting, a battle at a river, and the setting of Constantine's battle with Maxentius at the Milvian Bridge in 312, chroniclers hailed this victory of Theodosius as a victory like the victory of Constantine. Theodosius was a new Constantine because of this victory. Some half-century later, at the Council of Chalcedon in 451, the then Emperor Marcion and his wife Pulcheria were hailed as a new Constantine and a new Helena by the assembled bishops at the Council of Chalcedon. Over the course of a number of centuries, emperors were repeatedly given the title Constantine, the name Constantine, added to their given name, as well as maybe a dozen Eastern Byzantine emperors who were given the name Constantine at their birth. So Constantine was the most popular name among emperors in the Byzantine tradition. There were also new Constantines in the West. Constantine, of course, relocated the capital of the Roman Empire to Constantinople and moved the center of gravity from Rome to the east. And so it's normal, it seems natural, that there would be new Constantines emerging out of the Byzantine tradition who were ruling in Constantinople. But the same thing was true also in the West during the Middle Ages. Kings and rulers of various sorts were hailed as new Constantines because of their achievements, because of their various qualities as kings. Pope Adrian I proclaimed Charlemagne as a new Constantine because he defeated the Lombards. Papal scribes used that same title when they described Charlemagne. Charlemagne's coins were modeled on the coins that had been issued in the time of Constantine. And the story was that when Pope Stephen crowned Charlemagne's son Louis in 816 as the Western Roman Emperor, the Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, that he used the very crown that had been used by Constantine when he was coronated as a Roman Emperor. This connection between Charlemagne and his successors, the Carolingian kings in the West, and Constantine was something that the Carolingian kings wanted to cultivate. They wanted to continue this association with the first great Christian emperor. And so there are not only evidence from the coins, evidence from chroniclers, but also artistic evidence from the period of the Carolingian kings that indicated they wanted to have this kind of association with this earlier Christian emperor. In the mosaics that were put on the walls of the Lateran by Leo III, there is a painting of three figures on each side of a panel, each side of a doorway. On the one side, there's a picture of Peter, who is delivering the signs of papal authority to Leo III himself, and Charlemagne is along with him, and Charlemagne is receiving a standard from the Apostle Peter. Peter, as the supposed first pope, is passing on his authority to the Pope. He's also passing on the authority to the Western Emperor Charlemagne. On the other side of this doorway is a panel with three figures, which resembles and imitates the panel showing Charlemagne. But in this case, we have Christ himself giving the signs of papal authority to Pope Sylvester, who was supposedly the Pope who had baptized Constantine. And Constantine is being given the labarum, which is the sign the emblem that he used after his conversion when he went into battles during battles for the protection and extension of the Roman Empire. So you have Charlemagne and a pope and Peter on one side. You have Constantine and a pope and Christ himself on the other side. Clearly, Charlemagne and the pope who sponsored these mosaics wanted to associate Charlemagne with Constantine. We have the same kinds of things in Charlemagne's in Carolingian palaces. Charlemagne is in a series of paintings that includes Augustus and Constantine and Theodosius, and then a couple of Charlemagne's successors, and then Charlemagne himself is in that sequence. For nearly 1,000 years, this was a major thread of Christian political thinking, both in the Eastern Empire, Byzantium, and also the Western Empire in Europe. This association of Constantine and later kings. And most kings were in some way exhorted to become new Constantines. This is actually written into the canon laws of the Byzantine Church. The canon laws declared that the emperor should be most notable in orthodoxy and piety. He should be a pious emperor as Constantine was. My question tonight is to try to answer the question of why, or what that meant. What does it mean for an emperor to be pious? What did these popes mean when they exhorted various kings to become like Constantine? What did the canonists think they were saying when they said that an emperor should be pious as Constantine was pious? And a question that comes prior to that, a question that we have to answer prior to that question of what did they mean by imperial piety, is the question of what did they know about Constantine? What were the facts at their command? One of the things that got me interested in this topic was it's a good exercise in historical imagination. We tend to think, we tend to operate unthinkingly on the assumption that people of earlier ages had access to the same sources that we had. If you had a very ancient source, then people would, centuries later would have had the access to that same source, just as we do, and that they would have the same knowledge at their disposal that we have. But in this case, that's not true, and in many cases, that's not true. In fact, the common knowledge about Constantine throughout the history of Byzantium and throughout the history of Western Christendom in Europe is quite different from what we know as the common knowledge of Constantine. What they would have known would be things like the following. They would have known that Constantine was the product of a one-night stand between his father Constantius and his mother Helena, who was supposed to be an innkeeper's daughter. They would have known that Constantine was the first Christian emperor. And they would have known that he saw a sign of the cross in the sky, and he converted when he was told that that was a Christian sign. He put that sign on his banners and that became the standard, the battle standard for the Roman Empire. They knew that he had once suffered from leprosy, that Constantine had suffered from leprosy, and that he had gone to Pope Sylvester, and that by baptism at the hands of Pope Sylvester, that leprosy had been healed, and he had become clean of leprosy and also, of course, cleansed from his sins. They would have known that Constantine, in response to that gift of healing, had conferred certain lands in Italy to the Pope as the papal lands, the Vatican area, and also that he had conferred authority over the entire emperor to the Pope in a document that became known as the Donation of Constantine. They would have known that Constantine was the one who called the first ecumenical council of the Christian Church, the Council of Nicaea, where the Christian bishops assembled in order to address the conflict that originated in the city of Alexandria in Egypt and involved the question of the person of Christ, whether Christ was fully divine or not. That controversy was known as the Arian controversy, and it was resolved at the Council of Nicaea, and Constantine was the one who organized that church council. They would have known that Constantine suppressed pagan worship and that he appointed Christians to high positions in his empire. They would have known that Constantine founded the city of Constantinople. They would also have known that Constantine's mother, Helena, had gone to the Holy Land. She had founded a number of churches, and in the process of founding these churches, she had also recovered the true cross of Jesus Christ. That had been buried, and that was exhumed and recovered. If these earlier readers in the earlier centuries had read Jerome's Chronica, which is a kind of chronological summary of the history of the world, they would have also learned that Constantine killed his wife Fausta, and that in an old age he fell back into the Arian heresy and revived the persecution of the church. Now, the list of things that were known throughout the Middle Ages in the West and throughout Byzantium in the East is a mix of things that we now believe are true and things that we believe that are false. The donation of Constantine is probably the most spectacular example of something that has been proven false. This was the document that supposedly conferred imperial authority to the Pope from Constantine to the Pope in exchange or in gratitude for the healing that he had at his baptism. That was exposed as a forgery. There were suspicions about it during the Middle Ages, but that was exposed as a forgery by Lorenzo Valla in the 15th century. It's one of the great breakthroughs of the Renaissance to go back and actually look at this medieval document and to prove philologically and in other ways that this could not possibly have been from the hand of Constantine. And so much of Western Christendom and much of the Pope's authority had been based on what amounts to a forgery, something that was supposed to be from Constantine but was not. It's now known that Constantine did not suffer from any form of leprosy and that he was not baptized by Pope Sylvester. People would have known that if they had read Eusebius' Life of Constantine. He tells a different story about Constantine's baptism, as we'll see later this evening. But the sources that they had told them that he had been baptized by Sylvester and that he had been healed of leprosy in the process. There's nothing in the earliest sources about the romance between Constantius and Helena. Nothing about that one-night stand and the miraculous signs that surrounded Constantine's conception and birth. Nothing about that in the earliest sources concerning Constantine. There's nothing in the very earliest sources about Helena finding the fragment of the true cross or recovering the true cross of Jesus as a relic. Some of the things that these legends tell about that was a common knowledge of Byzantium and the common knowledge of the Western Christendom. Some of those things are true. Some of those things are, we believe, are still valid, but much of it is legend. This Constantine, so the Constantine of Byzantium and the Constantine of the Western Middle Ages is quite different from the Constantine, or I should say the Constantines that emerged from modern scholarship. But that Constantine of the Western Middle Ages and of Byzantium is also different, interestingly, from the first Constantine that was presented to the world in the Life of Constantine written by the church historian Eusebius, again shortly after the death of Constantine. That earliest source, one of the earliest sources, and one of the most complete sources from Constantine's own lifetime, is one that was barely known or barely consulted through much of the next 1,000 years. In the West, the reason why Eusebius was not consulted is because he wrote in Greek, and his book was never translated into Latin. It was translated into Latin only in the 16th century, as far as we can tell, and only the few Western readers who could read Greek were able to access it and make use of it. In the East, people who spoke Greek refused to accept Eusebius as a reliable source for a variety of reasons. One of the reasons was because Eusebius himself was suspected of being sympathetic to the Arian heresy that had been the source of the conflict that led to the Council of Nicaea. And so Eastern writers who talk about Eusebius say that they don't trust him because he's a heretic, or he is at least ambiguous about central issues in Christian faith. They also don't trust him because they realize that he's overlooked and skipped over some important factors. He gives a very spotty account of the sources of the Arian controversy and the events leading up to the Nicene Council. And so Eastern scholars, Eastern writers throughout the history of Byzantium didn't think much of Eusebius as a historian. And so Eusebius was not known either in the East or the West. And so when you have a pope or a Byzantine patriarch who exhorts an emperor or king to become a new Constantine, we can't explain what that means by going back to Eusebius. They didn't know Eusebius. Eusebius was technically available to them, but in fact it was not, Eusebius's biography was not used. And in place of that more contemporary account of the life of Constantine, that account of life of Constantine by somebody who had actually met Constantine, Eusebius, by somebody who lived at the same time as Constantine, that account was not as important as the legends that came much later. What I want to do this evening, as I mentioned, is to look at the contrasting images of Constantine, and particularly Constantine as an emperor characterized by piety. And I want to look at that not by comparing the way Constantine has been looked at in the past with the way he's looked at currently. I want to look at two different Constantines as they present themselves in the history of the reception of Constantine, if you will, starting with Eusebius and his account in the life of Constantine, the early biography of Constantine that I've mentioned, and then how Constantine's piety is depicted and described and enforced, and how the exhortations are given in later Byzantium and in Western Christendom. My focus is going to be on Western legends about Constantine. That's mainly because I know slightly more about that than I do about other things about Byzantium, and also because I think it's more directly relevant to our particular circumstances as Westerners. But let me begin by talking about piety a little bit. When we think of piety, we think of it as almost exclusively a religious value, maybe a religious virtue. To be pious is to be devoted to God. To be pious is to be someone devoted to prayer, someone devoted to pious exercises, someone devoted to the church. But in Latin and in the Greek world of the Greco-Roman world and Greek-speaking areas of the Greco-Roman world, piety had a much broader connotation. Pietas was not just a religious value. It was also a value that had to do with family life and politics. Pietas is, the Latin term pietas means the willingness and the readiness to fulfill obligations to those to whom we are bound, whoever they might be. It would apply certainly to the gods. If you're a pious person, you would be devoted to certain gods. You'd be devoted servant of a particular god. But a pious person would also be somebody who would honor his parents. That was an act of piety. Somebody who would honor his obligations to his friends. That was an act of piety. All of these various social obligations and political obligations, obligation to serve the state, that was also an act of piety. The emblem of the icon of piety coming out of the Roman world comes from Virgil's Aeneid. There's a scene early in the Aeneid when Aeneas is escaping from Troy. Aeneas is a Trojan, and he's living during the time of the Trojan War. The Greeks have infiltrated Troy with their Trojan horse, and they're burning the city around the Trojans. And Aeneas, the Trojan, is leaving the city. And as he leaves the city, he is holding his father Anchises on his back. He's carrying him on his back. He's holding the household gods of the royal family of Troy, and he's leading his son Ascanius away from the city. So the old city is burning, but he's showing his piety by his respect for his father. He's carrying his father on his back. He's showing his piety by his devotion to the future of Troy, to a new Troy, which is going to be Rome. That's what the story of the Aeneid is about. It's about the transition from old Troy to new Troy, the transition of Aeneas from Troy into the founding of Rome. And he's carrying the household gods. He's devoted to the gods of Troy, and he's going to take those household gods, those civic gods of Troy, and he's going to use them to found a new Troy once he gets to Italy. That's a picture of what piety involves. It's not just devotion to the gods, but it also involves devotion to the city of which you're a part of. It involves devotion to the past and to a heritage, to parents, and also for Aeneas particularly, it involves a devotion to the future and a submission to the fate that he has been given as the founder of a new Troy. Later on, in one of the most famous episodes in the Aeneid, Aeneas has to leave Dido behind. He stops for a time in Carthage, and he and Dido have a dalliance of some sort. But then he has to leave Dido behind because Carthage is not New Troy. He has to move on to Italy. And as he leaves, Virgil describes him as Pious Aeneas, pious Aeneas. He's pious because he's submitting himself to the fate that has been imposed on him. He's pious because he's going to follow that fate all the way to Italy and leave behind the false home of Carthage, leave Carthage in ruins, as, of course, the Romans would later do in reality. That's an image of piety. Those are the dimensions of piety in the Roman world. And piety was a virtue not only for everyday Romans, for the normal Romans, but also particularly a virtue for the emperors. And in this particular respect, the religious dimensions are very important. a Roman emperor had to be devoted to the gods and had to please the gods, because the peace of Rome depended on the peace of the gods. The Pax Romana depended on the Pax Deorum. You had to keep the gods happy in order for the gods to keep Rome prosperous. And a Roman emperor would do that by his devotion to the gods in sacrifice. He would do it by prayer, by doing games and so on for the gods. He had to show his devotion to the gods in order to keep Rome happy. In Roman ideology, there's an interconnection, there's an almost causal connection between piety and the happiness of the emperor and the empire and the success of the emperor in battle. Those three things, piety and happiness and victory, are bound together in the Roman mind. To Roman historians, pietas was not a constant of Roman history. That is to say, there were emperors who were more pious than others. There were periods of time when the empire itself and the people of the empire were more pious than they had been in previous times. And Roman historians frequently, Roman historians and panegyrists who would present speeches to the emperors would frequently speak about emperors as reviving Rome by their acts of piety. With every renewal of Rome, there would be a renewal of piety. The emperor would redevote himself to the gods. He would encourage the people to redevote themselves to God. The new golden age of Rome would always be a religious golden age. It would also always involve the renewal of the satisfaction of the gods and of pious devotion to the gods. It was common for Roman historians to contrast, when they were talking about a particularly pious emperor, it was common for them to contrast the impiety of the previous age, of the Pious, the former time, and the piety of the Nunc, of the now time, the present time. That earlier emperor was not so pious, and the gods became angry, and Rome suffered some defeats. But now a new emperor has come, Nunc, a new emperor has come, and the emperor is being revived because this new emperor is actually devoted to the gods in the way that he should. This whole concept of piety was transformed into a Christian context by a number of writers in the early centuries of Christianity, particularly in the 4th century. One of them was Prudentius, a Christian poet who wrote a number of hymns that in some Christian churches are still sung. And one of those, I believe, was Eusebius. Eusebius, when he writes the life of Constantine, is writing that life of Constantine with this notion of piety in the background. This notion of piety that is not just devotion to the gods in a kind of private and personal sense, but devotion to the gods in a way that has public and political consequences. And I want to explain how that works in Eusebius' life of Constantine. But before I do, I want to say a few things about Eusebius. I've mentioned that Eusebius was distrusted by Byzantine scholars during the history of Byzantium because he was considered to be a sympathizer with the Arians, with the heretics. He was not very well known in the West, particularly, or at least for his life of Constantine. His other major historical work, the Church History, was translated into Latin, but that church history doesn't have as much detail about Constantine as his biography does. And so he wasn't known very much in the West as a biographer of Constantine. So in the Middle Ages, both East and West, Eusebius was not a major source for people's knowledge of the first Christian emperor. And in modern historiography, Eusebius has been neglected or distrusted for a variety of reasons. He is seen as somebody who whitewashes the life of Constantine, who excuses Constantine for acts of brutality or just ignores them. I briefly mentioned the fact that Jerome records the fact that Constantine's wife Fausta was put to death during Constantine's reign, which is true. Jerome records it, Eusebius does not. That would have been a black mark on the life of the first Christian emperor, and so Eusebius, who must have known that this was the case, simply ignores it and suppresses it. At about the same time that Fausta was put to death, Fausta was executed, Constantine's oldest son, Crispus, was also executed. The circumstances of this are debated. I don't think it's ever going to be clear exactly what was happening. There are some stories about some kind of inappropriate relationship between Fausta and her stepson, Crispus. But whatever the case, Crispus was also executed. Eusebius does not mention that anywhere. He, in fact, doesn't mention that Constantine had a son named Crispus. again, it's something that Eusebius must have known, but he wants to give such a positive portrait of Constantine that he scratches out those black marks and he whitewashes the emperor. This is part of a characterization of Eusebius as being an obsequious court theologian who wants to get on Constantine's good side, and so he praises Constantine and he does what he can to ignore the black marks and the blemishes in Constantine's record. It's also thought today that Eusebius tends to exaggerate how close he was to the emperor. A superficial reading of the life of Constantine would indicate that Eusebius was around the Emperor Constantine a great deal, that he was an intimate of the emperor, that he was one of the main theologians, one of the main bishops that would have been close to the emperor. That's probably not the case. It's probably more the case that Eusebius was with the emperor on a number of discrete occasions. He did know the emperor personally. He had met him, usually in the company of other bishops, such as like at the Council of Nicaea. He was not somebody who would have had a lot of intimate, personal, one-on-one conversations with Constantine, although that's the impression that one can get from reading his book. It's also thought that, at least it was thought at one time, that Eusebius had concocted a number of the documents that he cites in his life of Constantine. The book is not only a biography of Constantine, but also cites lengthy sections from various edicts and laws that Constantine passed during his lifetime. And it was thought for a long time that some of those were just things that Eusebius wished Constantine had passed, edicts that he wished he had written and promulgated, but he did not. At least one modern perspective on Eusebius is summed up by Jacob Burckhardt, the great 19th century historian who wrote a life of Constantine, who described Eusebius as the most dishonest of classical historians. Recent scholarship has swung somewhat the other way, while recognizing that Eusebius has overlooked a number of things, important factors, and particularly negative things about Constantine's life, and also recognizing that he does, the book is in praise of Constantine. Contemporary historians have taken Eusebius somewhat more seriously as a historian. Part of the reason for that is that some of the documents, some of the edicts that were thought to be Eusebian things that Eusebius himself wrote have been proven to be edicts that Constantine wrote and promulgated. In other words, other copies have shown up. We've been able to check them against the text in the life of Constantine, and we realize that Eusebius actually was talking about things that actually laws that Constantine actually passed and promulgated. My interest in Eusebius has less to do with his accuracy as a historian than in the way that he presents Constantine and the idea of piety that he presents in his life of Constantine. So for my purposes, that we can kind of put those concerns about his accuracy to the side and just look at how he presents Constantine and what kind of model of imperial piety emerges from the life of Constantine written by Eusebius. How would Eusebius answer the question, what is a pious emperor to do? One of the complaints against Eusebius has been that he has written a biography that is fragmented and unfinished. It is not as smooth and well put together as some of Eusebius's other works, but I think it actually has much more unity than some historians have suggested. I think the book actually revolves around this specific question of imperial piety. Eusebius begins his biography by talking about the death of Constantine and by talking about how Constantine is now exalted in heaven. His soul is exalted in his communing with God. And in the course of that, he repeatedly talks about Constantine's piety. He established a pattern of piety that made him a herald of piety to everyone around him. He instructed his troops, when he was leading his troops into battle, Constantine instructed his troops in piety. All of his actions as emperor, Eusebius says, were intended to shine the light of piety throughout the empire. He is pious not only in his words, in what he claims and what he says he believes, but also in his actions, according to Eusebius. Piety is a major theme at the beginning of the book. In the middle of the book, at the beginning of Book 3, the life of Constantine is divided into 4 chapters or 4 books. The beginning of the 3rd book, which is the middle of the life of Constantine, Eusebius returns to this theme of Constantine's piety. But here, at the beginning of Book 3, he particularly emphasizes how Constantine's piety has caused a major and radical shift in Roman history. I think here Eusebius is taking a page from earlier Roman historians who contrasted the impiety of earlier ages with the piety of the current age. And Eusebius is saying that, like other Roman emperors, Constantine has inaugurated a new golden age in Roman history because of his piety. Of course, Eusebius thinks that he's inaugurated the golden age of Roman history because Constantine is devoted to the God that Eusebius believes is the one true God. Those earlier emperors might have been pious, but they were pious toward idols. This Christian emperor is pious toward the true God, and so he really does revive the empire and give it a new lease on life. But at the beginning of Book 3, Eusebius goes through a whole series of contrasts between what was true then with previous emperors and what is true now under Constantine. Previous emperors worshipped and served non-existent gods, but Constantine, Eusebius says, recognizes the true God. Previous emperors mocked and slandered Christ, but Constantine seeks Christ as his protection, and Constantine puts himself under the protection of the cross. Previous emperors had driven away the servants of God. They had suppressed and persecuted Christians. Constantine protects Christians. Previous emperors had broken down churches, but Constantine rebuilds churches and builds new ones. Previous emperors had burned Bibles, but Constantine not only preserves Bibles, but actually takes money out of the imperial treasury and gives it to Eusebius of Caesarea, the biographer, to produce a new edition of the Bible that can be distributed. The previous emperors prohibited councils of bishops, but Constantine actually assembles councils of bishops so they can resolve problems and disputes within the church. All the way through this opening section of Book 3, Eusebius is contrasting what was true then, Pious, with what is true now, Nunc. He's taking a page out of the earlier historians, and the decisive thing that makes the age of Constantine different is the piety of Constantine. It's the fact that he is devoting himself to the true God. And that has immediate political and cultural ramifications. Eusebius begins by talking about Constantine's piety. In the middle of the book, he returns to that theme, and then at the end of the book, he again returns to the theme of Constantine's piety. And here he's emphasizing the uniqueness of Constantine. Almost every clause of the last paragraphs of Eusebius' biography begin with the Greek word monon, which means only or alone. Constantine is the only emperor ever to honor God. He's the only one ever to honor and support the church, the only one ever to destroy idolatry. He's the only one that deserves all of the plaudits and the praise that Roman emperors had been receiving for many centuries. So the whole book is kind of organized around this theme of piety. It's the theme that's announced at the beginning, it's the theme that's announced in the middle of the book, and then again at the end. And for Eusebius, that piety of Constantine, his devotion to the true God, is the reason why Constantine's reign is something new. It's the reason why there's a light shining now when there had once been darkness. That's, again, picking up on this earlier conception of piety and the importance of piety in the Roman imagination for the renewal of the empire. Eusebius is giving that a Christian interpretation, but the structure of his understanding of piety is the same. In the same way, Eusebius emphasizes Constantine's piety by talking about his success in battle and in various political struggles. One of the intriguing things about Eusebius' life of Constantine is the way he begins. Early in the book he says, I'm not interested in all the things that most biographers of emperors are interested in. I'm not interested in battles. I'm not interested in political struggles. I'm not interested in laws. I'm only interested in the things pertaining to God. That's what I'm going to emphasize. But then you start turning the pages and you realize that a lot of the book is taken up with descriptions of battles. And a lot of the book is taken up with lengthy quotations from laws. And a lot of the book is taken up with the normal things that a biographer would be concerned about if he were writing a biography of a Roman emperor. The introduction and to the book, to the biography, and the biography itself don't seem to match. And that's one of the reasons why historians have suggested that Eusebius kind of patched together different things, that he actually had maybe two different books going, One book that was emphasizing maybe Constantine's life and his character, another book that was emphasizing a compilation of his edicts, and he just smushed them together into a single book. I think rather, although without denying that there are imperfections in the style of the book, of the biography, I think Eusebius knows what he's doing. When he says he's not interested in military and political affairs, I think he means that, but he means it in the sense that he's not interested in those in themselves. What he's interested in is how those political and military affairs emphasize and illustrate the piety of Constantine. He's drawing again on that previous tradition of Roman pietas and emphasizing the fact that piety brings success. And so he says things throughout the book about the way Constantine's success in battles demonstrate his piety. He says that God promises to reward those who devote themselves to him. And God promises or threatens to suppress those who oppose him, the theomachoi, the God fighters. God fights against those who fight against him. God supports those who are devoted to him. And Eusebius thinks that this promise and threat from God is actually demonstrated in the life of Constantine and in the lives of preceding emperors. There's an earlier treatise by Lactantius, a Latin theologian of the same period, called On the Deaths of the Persecutors. If you're looking for a gruesome ancient text, this is a good gruesome ancient text to read. Lactantius tells the stories of persecuting emperors. And in his telling, every one of them met a very bad end, some of them a very gruesome end. And he's using that to argue that God opposes those who oppose him. Eusebius is saying the same thing. And so Constantine's victories over God's enemies, over his own enemies, become evidence of Constantine's piety. So Eusebius is not interested in the battles and the strategy for their own sake. He's interested in those battles because they make his case that Constantine is devoted to the true God, and the true God supports those who honor him. In fact, he goes so far as to talk about Constantine as a teacher of piety and even a preacher of piety. The word is keruka. Keruka is the Greek word for a herald or a preacher. Constantine's own life is kind of teaching an object lesson. It's a kind of proclamation about the dangers of opposing God and the blessings of honoring God. So Constantine just goes about his business as emperor, and he becomes a teacher of piety because of the way God organizes his life and gives him success. In fact, in one particularly interesting passage, Eusebius actually uses the verb martyreo to describe Constantine's success in battle and Constantine's political successes. Martyreo, you can tell from the word itself that it's the Greek word that's at the basis of the word martyr. The word martyr means witness, one who makes testimony. But by the time of Eusebius, it had the particular connotation of one who gives testimony to Jesus Christ and is persecuted or killed because of their testimony. But Eusebius uses that word to describe what's happening with Constantine. Constantine testifies to the reality of the true God, he says, because of his military and political successes. That becomes another form of witness. Previous witnesses to Christ were persecuted and killed by Roman emperors. Now we have a Roman emperor who is actually a Christian, and he's one who is testifying to God God is testifying to him, as it were, by giving him success. So to make my point again, when Eusebius says he's not interested in all that political and military material, and then goes ahead and talks about it, the reason he's doing that is because what he wants to emphasize in those political and military affairs is the piety of the emperor. Once we put all that together, then we realize that much of the life of Constantine is a kind of instruction manual for kings. Eusebius intends it not only to be a life, a historical study, but he intends it to be, like Plutarch's Lives, a kind of exemplum of how you should conduct yourself if you're a Christian emperor. And he's particularly writing it for the sons of Constantine. He's trying to show them how their father conducted themselves, and he's urging them to conduct themselves in a similar way. And so when we see that, we see that the whole treatise, the whole biography is, in a sense, about imperial piety. So we ask the question to Eusebius, what does a pious life look like for an emperor? And it does involve, according to Eusebius, it does involve personal devotion to the true God. Eusebius emphasizes that Constantine was consistent in prayer. He emphasized that Constantine was able to get texts of the Bible, and he studied them personally in the palace. Eusebius tells us that Constantine would regularly gather the members of the court, and he would instruct them. He would become like a preacher to the members of the court, and he would teach them about Christianity. In fact, Eusebius includes one of these discourses called the Oration to the Assembly of Saints. It's the one example we have of Constantine giving a lecture or a talk to his court about Christian faith. And it's a kind of a Christian apologetics and a summary of the Christian story and a summary of the Bible. So Constantine displayed piety in those narrow senses of being devoted to the true God, Eusebius says. But I think what Eusebius is trying to get at is the primary acts of piety for Constantine are his actions as emperor. The kinds of laws that he passes are displays of piety. He passes laws that Eusebius describes as philanthropic, laws that are beneficial to the people that he rules, and laws that contain and exude an aroma of piety. So when Constantine goes about his business as an emperor, issuing edicts, trying to address problems throughout the empire, he does that, according to Eusebius, as a servant of God, and he does that in a way that expresses his piety. Constantine's treatment of the church as the emperor is another example of his piety. He supports the church. He provides funds so that the church can build new buildings, repair buildings that have been destroyed or damaged by persecutors. He gives instructions to local bishops to gather money from their local areas. He gets his imperial officials to assist in the raising of funds so that they can build a cathedral or a church in a particular city. Constantine also displays his piety, as I mentioned, in arranging for councils. The Council of Nicaea is the most important one during his reign, but he also facilitated the assembly of other smaller assemblies, and in order so that the church could resolve its disputes. One of Constantine's concerns is that the church remain unified. He wants the church to remain unified because he believes that a disunified church will be displeasing to God. If Christians are fighting with each other, then God will be displeased. And Constantine thinks if God is displeased with the church, then God will be displeased also with the empire. So there's a kind of political motive in that, but he's trying to unify the church to keep God, so that God will continue to bless his empire. Even Constantine's prayer life, as Eusebius describes it, is not just a personal devotion. It also has these public connotations. He's devoted to prayer, especially when he's engaging in military operations. Eusebius famously describes how Constantine set up a kind of prayer tent near the war camp of his soldiers. He set up a prayer tent similar to the tabernacle of Moses, and Eusebius makes this direct analogy with Moses. And he talks about how Constantine, prior to a battle, would go and devote himself to prayer. He would fast, and he would go through other ascetic exercises in order to win God's favor for the upcoming battle. So even when Constantine is engaged in acts that we would recognize in our modern usage as pious acts, that is, prayer and fasting and other ascetic practices, even then Eusebius recognizes that it has these political connotations. So for Eusebius, a pious emperor is one who devotes himself to the true God personally in prayer and devotion, but also who devotes himself to the true God in the way he conducts his business as emperor. As in previous centuries, pietas for Eusebius doesn't just mean personal, private piety, but it has political connotations. It has immediate political ramifications. So a pious emperor will support the church. He'll try to battle tyrants. He'll enact philanthropic laws that benefit the people, not only the Christians, but also all the Roman people that he rules. He will enter into battle knowing that God is the one who decides the outcome of the battle. And so he'll enter into battle in prayer, asking God to give him blessing in that battle. Because a pious emperor trusts and obeys God, God blesses that, Eusebius says, and because of that, a pious emperor wins. He wins his battles because God is on his side. And these victories make him a preacher and a teacher of piety, because people can watch the emperor, see him devoted to the true God, see him putting the cross and other Christian symbols on his coins and on his battle standards, and they learn that the true God blesses those who honor him. Pietas for Eusebius, in other words, expresses itself in political acts and in a specific imperial context. That's how I understand Eusebius's understanding of imperial piety. When we get to the later legends of Constantine, we have a significantly different emphasis as far as imperial piety is concerned. Some of the elements are common to Eusebius and these later legends. Eusebius, as I've mentioned, emphasizes the connection between piety and success. A pious emperor is going to win victories because he's honoring God, and God rewards those who honor him. He emphasized the importance of piety for the renewal of the empire. And later conceptions would emphasize the same. But these later legends also redirect the focus of piety in important ways that produce, first of all, Western Christendom, and I think in some ways lead up to prepare the way for modern understandings of the relationship between piety and politics. One of these episodes that is told quite differently in Eusebius and in these later legends is the baptism of Constantine. Constantine, according to Eusebius, Constantine intended to be baptized late in his life when he began to feel ill, and he became convinced that his remaining time was very short. He had always, according to Eusebius, he had always wanted to be baptized as Jesus was in the Jordan River, so he made preparations to go to the Holy Land so that he could be baptized in the Jordan River. He didn't get that far. He got as far as Nicomedia, where another Eusebius, another bishop, Eusebius that wrote the biography is Eusebius of Caesarea. Eusebius is also the name of the bishop of Nicomedia. Eusebius is based on the Greek word for piety. So it's common. It's not unusual, not unnatural for lots of bishops to be named Eusebius. Eusebia is the Greek word for piety. So Bishop Eusebius of Nicomedia, who was associated with the Arians, baptized Constantine in his last hours. And according to Eusebius's account, the effects on Constantine were quite dramatic. After he was baptized, he was convinced he was dying. After he was baptized, he put aside all his imperial clothing, the purple robe that designated the emperor. He put that aside. He wore the baptismal gown, the white baptismal gown, and he said he was never again going to assume the imperial colors. He was never going to return to his imperial power. In fact, the way that Eusebius describes it, Constantine seems to have thought that there was some kind of fundamental contradiction between baptism and functioning as emperor. There's this ambiguity about whether Constantine was fully a Christian while he functioned as emperor. This is a very interesting phenomenon in Eusebius' life of Constantine, because this comes at the very end of a biography that has consistently emphasized the piety of Constantine, as I've already mentioned. It's consistently emphasized the fact that Constantine was devoted to the true God, that he supported the church, all these acts of piety, and then you get to the end, and Constantine himself seems to be saying, I've not been a Christian until now. Now that I'm baptized, now I'm truly a Christian, and I can devote myself to the service of God in a way that I haven't. That's not the account of the baptism that was common knowledge through most of the 1,000 years between Constantine's own lifetime and the beginning of the modern era. In both Byzantium and also in the Western Christendom in Europe, it was believed that Constantine was baptized fairly early in his life, at the beginning of his reign, not by Eusebius of Nicomedia, who was an Arian sympathizer and would be kind of suspect because of that, but rather by a pope, by Pope Sylvester in particular. I've mentioned, I've alluded to this story already, but the full story is that Constantine, according to this is in the book of the popes, the book of that tells the story of different popes in the Acts of Sylvester. that tells of the baptism of Constantine. Constantine came down with a particularly virulent form of leprosy. He asked doctors in his court how to heal it, and they couldn't figure out a way. He asked the priests in Rome how to heal his leprosy, and they said, if you bathe in a basin of infant blood from human infants, then you'll be healed. And so Constantine assembles all the infants that he can find from around Rome, and is preparing to have them all slaughtered so he can bathe in the infant blood. The night before this is supposed to happen, Peter and Paul, the apostles, appear to him in a dream. He renounces that first. He hears the cries before the dream happens. He hears the cries of the babies and the mothers, and he realizes this is kind of a horrible thing to do. Apparently that hadn't occurred to him until he heard them. I can't do this. I can't follow through. And so he sends them all home and gives them gifts and sends them off. And then that night, after he's renounced that plan, Peter and Paul appear to him in a dream. And they tell him that he should seek out Pope Sylvester. Sylvester can point him to the true God and can also heal his leprosy. And so he seeks out Pope Sylvester, and he is baptized. And the very same time that he's baptized, he's cleansed of his leprosy. That's, if you would ask somebody in the 8th century, the 9th century, the 10th century, you'd ask anybody from about 500 or 600 to about 1500 when Constantine was baptized and by whom. That's the story that they would have told, which is simply, it's not the case. This is common knowledge that was false for the better part of a millennium or more. But it shows the direction of imperial piety, the direction of the understanding of imperial piety, and the way it's different from Eusebius. There's none of the ambiguity that Eusebius leaves you with about the relationship between baptism and imperial power. That's there in Eusebius. It's, again, quite dramatic in Eusebius, given the way that Eusebius has told the story of Constantine. There's none of that ambiguity in the Acts of Sylvester. Instead, Constantine is quite... he's baptized and he goes about his business as emperor without a second thought. There's also obviously an orientation to the papacy that you don't find in Eusebius. Eusebius was writing at a time before the full development of the papal claims that developed in the later Middle Ages. The story of Sylvester is somewhat later, and it's part of trying to emphasize the authority of the Pope. And not surprisingly, whenever the popes got into conflicts with the emperors in the West, they would pull out this story. And remember, it was Pope Sylvester who healed the Emperor Constantine. Remember, the popes are the ones who can heal emperors. And so emperors should give deference to bishops. That became the lesson of Constantine's conversion. All the way through the Middle Ages, from the time of Charlemagne at least on, Christian writers frequently wrote instruction manuals for kings. Christian theologians and bishops would write treatises on how to be a good Christian king. And invariably, they pointed to Constantine, and pointed to Constantine as an example of a king who acted piously precisely because he honored the Pope and did what the Pope wanted to do. This is also the lesson, interestingly, that's taken from some of the accounts of Constantine's founding of Constantinople. This doesn't look like a natural way to support papal claims, but in the way that the story is told, in certain texts from the Middle Ages, that's exactly what happened. In Eusebius, Constantine founded Constantinople because he wanted to found a thoroughly Christian city. Rome, of course, had this pagan past. Constantine had helped to build churches in Rome. He had given Rome some Christian elements, but he didn't destroy the pagan monuments and the pagan buildings. Some of them were converted into Christian churches, but a lot of the pagan past of Rome was still visible. Then you had this mix of pagan and Christian. According to Eusebius, Constantine wanted to found a capital city that would be consistently and thoroughly Christian, a thoroughly Christian civic space as his capital. And so Constantinople was built according to those specifications. In later legends, though, Constantine's building of Constantinople, his founding of Constantinople, was turned in various directions to support this or that policy of political actors, or particularly of popes. It's particularly interesting that the donation of Constantine, which I mentioned earlier, refers to the founding of Constantinople and uses that founding to support the claims that the Pope oversees and is himself oversees the empire and is himself a kind of emperor. The donation of Constantine, to remind you, was the document that was produced probably during the 8th or 9th century. It was a forged document. It purported to be from Constantine and purported to be Constantine's gift of imperial power to the papacy, his gift of, and also his gift of the papal lands to the popes. This is a passage from the donation of Constantine. These are supposed to be the words of Constantine himself. We have seen it to be fitting that our empire and the power of the kingship should be transferred and translated to the eastern regions, and that in the province of Byzantium, in the most suitable place, a city should be built in our name and our empire established there. He's talking about, of course, the founding of Constantinople, which is founded on the ancient city of Byzantium. Now, the reason why transfer the empire to the east, he says, it's not just that an earthly emperor, like me, Constantine, should exercise authority where the government of priests and the head of the Christian religion have been installed by the heavenly emperor. Excuse me. The rationale is there's already a representative of Christ, the heavenly emperor, in Rome. It would be unfitting to have these two contesting emperors in Rome, the Roman emperor and the Pope. And so Constantine defers to the Pope, leaves Rome and the West to him, and goes off to found Constantinople. The donation of Constantine, as I said, was one of the founding documents of the Western Middle Ages. It was the document that popes consistently returned to justify their claims to have power over kings and princes. And the rationale, again, is given here that the Pope is himself a kind of emperor in his own domain, and Constantine's life and Constantine's piety, his deference to the Pope, is an example because it is an example for other kings. After about the 12th century, the use of Constantine as a model for other Christian kings begins to wane. In the High Middle Ages and later Middle Ages, you find treatises on kingship that barely refer to Constantine, that don't mention him at all. And in addition to just ignoring Constantine, the later Middle Ages are full of criticisms of Constantine, writers who are attacking Constantine. Frequently they're attacking Constantine because they believe Constantine was the one who gave the papacy so much power. So later medieval figures like John Wycliffe and Jan Hus, who are kind of proto-reformers, they're against the claims of the papacy. But because they're against the papacy, they're also against Constantine, because they believe that Constantine gave the papacy its power. This is a confusing kind of, the battle lines don't always match up easily. People, defenders of the papacy, sometimes also oppose Constantine. Bernard of Clairvaux, for example, thought that Constantine was responsible for the corruption of the church. He was, because he believed that the donation of Constantine was real, that it was actually Constantine's gift to the Pope, he was worried that that gift had made the popes very powerful and very rich, and that made the popes corrupt. So Bernard of Clairvaux was anti-Constantinian precisely because he was pro-pope. Others were anti-Constantinian because they were also anti-papacy. The vision that we find at the end of Purgatorio in Dante's Divine Comedy expresses a common late medieval sentiment. Dante sees this vision, an allegorical vision of the history of the church, and the chariot of the church is infected with heresy, but then it's also laden down and broken because of a large amount of gold that's poured into it. So the wealth of the church becomes a great scandal for many late medieval Christians. So Constantine became less popular as a figure to be imitated. In the Renaissance, further, the politics had moved on. There was no longer the necessity, according to Renaissance and early modern thinkers, there was no longer the necessity for popes to be, for emperors to be pious. Machiavelli doesn't care if the king is pious or not. He wants the prince to be effective, and to be effective, he may want to present a public picture of piety. He might want to be believed to be pious, but actual piety would get in the way. If he was actually pious, then he might not do the things that he needs to make sure that he can rule effectively. If he needs to, say a prayer or say, "In God we trust," or "God bless America" at the end of every speech, if that will enhance his power, then he should do it. But he shouldn't get tangled up in actual piety. Politics had changed. But in my view, and this will be my concluding comment, in my view, the politics that we find in the early modern period, which are preparing for the secular politics that we have today, where piety and politics are quite distinct, quite separate concerns, was obviously not the case in Eusebius. It's much more the case in a writer like Machiavelli, and certainly in later political writers in the early modern period and beyond. But I think that was already being prepared during the time when Constantine was being presented as a model piety. I think the shift that I've been describing is part of the story of the secularization of Western politics. Because what's happened from the time of Eusebius through these legends of Constantine, what's happened is that the piety of the emperor has become detached from any really political orientation. For Eusebius, piety and politics are all tangled up together. A pious emperor is one who is pious in his actual conduct of policy, in the kinds of laws that he passes, in the way that he conducts war, in the way that he treats the enemies that he conquers. That's the way that a king expresses piety. When you get to the High Middle Ages, the way a king expresses piety has very little to do with his actual policy or his actual political activity. It has much more to do with his devotion to the Pope and devotion to bishops. Renaissance and later writers, I think, in this sense, were simply following out the logical trajectory of some medieval writers, because they had the relevance of piety to politics had already become uncertain, and Constantine's role as a model for politics had already become uncertain, as much by those who praised him as by those who wanted to bury him. Thank you very much.